Welcome to the Tour de France 2023. And one of the most interesting questions I received over and over again after my first video on all the teams' bike tech, so their power meters, their bike computers, all the good like chipset stuff that goes on there, you can check out that video in the corner, is are any of the teams using power meter pedals? And if not, why? After all, power meter pedals been out for almost a decade now, and I've pretty much become like the standard for many consumers to use. So with that, we're gonna dive into the team area, and I'm gonna dig into this question a little bit more. Now, inside the rider zone, the Tour de France does require masks, so that's why I've got it on here. So the bigger question is, why are there no power meter pedals? Because there actually has been power meter pedals in the past, over the past decade or so, as different companies announce products and want to get those products in front of people. These days, though, there are also power meter pedals on the women's peloton. And last year at the Women's Tour de France, the Tour de France Femme avec Zwift, we saw a couple teams with power meter pedals. We saw some teams with Wahoo's Speedplay-based power meter pedals, and we saw some teams with Favero's Asioma power meter pedals. Both of those power meter pedals are, of course, very well respected and are quite accurate. In fact, with various sponsorships that Wahoo has in place for this year, 2023, I'll have to see in a few weeks, but I suspect we could see up to 20% of the women's peloton on power meter pedals by the time we get to the Tour de France in a few weeks there for them. Now, there are three core reasons why there are not power meter pedals on the men's side today. I'm gonna walk through all those, and I'm gonna talk about why that's probably changing in the future. The very first reason is sponsorships. So on the back of every single team car, every single team bus, and of course the rider jersey, you see the team sponsors. In this case, Shimano and SRAM are the two biggest ones. Shimano accounts for more than half of the peloton's drivetrains, and with that, their power meters. And then once we get beyond that, we've got SRAM as well as other drivetrain manufacturers and other power meter companies that account for the remainder of them. Again, you can check that out in that video up in the corner of them. Now, in the case of Shimano, they've got not just the entire drivetrain, but also the power meter that you see right there. In this case, it's the R9200P. Before that, it was the R9100P. Both of their power meter variants of their Dura-Ace. They also have an equivalent for the Ultegra side. Shimano has always been very, very active in the pro peloton in terms of sponsorships and ensuring that they've got that visibility across the board. We've always seen them have about probably half or so, sometimes more. The closest we saw to a split in the peloton was back when SRAM introduced ETAP, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, something like that. And in those couple of years, SRAM spiked their sponsorships of teams, yet it was in those same years that we actually saw the power meter pedals on the team bikes. Why is that? Well, because back then, the Shimanos and the SRAMs of the world didn't actually see those power meters as competitive to their own interests. Back then, Shimano had their drivetrain, they didn't have power meters of their own, but these days, both companies have power meters of their own, and they want to promote those. Sponsorships that you see on the back of these teams are expensive. For a lower tier component, something like a trainer or something in that realm there, you're looking at about $130,000, give or take, per team per year for those lower tier components. When you start talking higher tier components, things like drivetrains or even bikes, that cost spikes quite a bit more. It also spikes with what team you have. Team something like Cofidis is a cheaper team to buy because the results aren't as strong, versus a team like Jumbo-Visma is a more expensive team to buy. Now, as I said, historically, SRAM and Shimano didn't see power meter companies as competitors, but these days, contractually, they do. And so you, generally speaking, will not get a Shimano drivetrain with a competitor on a different power meter type. There have been a handful of exceptions to that. For example, we saw Four Eyes sponsoring one team, but even that was very mixed on the team bikes, where about half of them had Four Eyes and half of them had Shimano. Now, if you're finding this video interesting or useful, just go ahead and whack that like button at the bottom there. It really does help this video and the channel quite a bit. Okay, so the first reason is drivetrain sponsorships. The second reason, historically speaking anyways, was cleat types. For example, most of the riders here on Dura-Ace cleats, likely because they're sponsored by Shimano and sponsored for that pedal. Again, another sponsored item on the check sheet there. Some teams don't have pedal contracts, but most of them do. But back in the day, it was cited as a reason why some riders may not have switched to power meter pedals. And that's because back then, some riders actually had individual sponsorships for pedals that would conflict with the type sponsorships, so in other words, Look versus Shimano versus Speedplay, of the power meter pedals that were offered then. But these days, power meter pedals come in virtually all cleat types. You've got Garmin with both Look and Shimano Shimano SPD if you want it for the mountain bike side. You've got Wahoo with the Speedplay side, Favero Asioma again with both Shimano and Look style pedals, and SRM with both types of Shimano pedals as well. This cleat type is no longer the barrier to entry it was 7 or so years ago. Now, the next reason is that power meter pedals were historically a bit finicky. These days, with the current generation, Rally or Vector 3 pedals, as well as Wahoo's and Favero Asioma pedals, you don't have to do a bunch of funky install stuff. But back in the day, with Garmin's original Vector 1 pedals or the Look Polar solution, which then became the Look SRM solution, and other options on the market, the installation of those pedals was frankly a pain in the ass. You had to go ahead and have a special tool that went around the back of the crank arm. You had to go ahead and install it, did a certain torque. it was all over the map. But now you can reliably install power meter pedals in just seconds, like 15 seconds, crank that down and you're good to go. Likewise, another common item that was often brought up was potentially cornering clearance. Now, that's generally not an issue here in a race like the Tour de France. It tends to be more of a crit thing, but even that has changed. From back in the day when those spindles were longer and thus required more space and thus reduced the cornering clearance. But even in those scenarios, the cornering clearance, the angle, as I've shown in my reviews, how far you'd have to get, the angle was insane, and even within that, it was only about 1 or 2 degrees between the power meter pedals and the non-power equivalencies. The next reason a lot of people think they're not used is weight. Now this is interesting because generally speaking, power meter pedals are a slight bit heavier than regular pedals, but honestly, that's not an issue for most World Tour teams. The thing you have to keep in mind is there's a UCI minimum bike weight of 6.8 kilograms. And essentially all the components on here are basically just at that threshold. They're actually trying to maintain that threshold because the component manufacturers, the bike manufacturers today, can go ahead and go far lower than 6.8 kilos, but that's the UCI rule in place. Plus, if weight was actually a concern for these teams, they certainly wouldn't be throwing on Garmin Edge 1040 Solars. Weight isn't really an issue these days. So what about accuracy? Well, accuracy isn't really a concern either, or it doesn't seem to be a concern anyways. One, all the power meter pedals from those top tiers of Garmin, Wahoo, and Favero are equally accurate. They all have their little quirks like any power meter brand out there, but they're equally accurate in reference testing for myself and many others that do this for a living. Plus, when you have the Shimano R9200P and 9100P on team bikes, then we can all just throw accuracy out the window. Those are the least accurate power meters that you can buy or just even be given anywhere here at the Tour de France. And unfortunately, more than half the teams have them on there. Thus proving again, it's all about sponsorship. So the final question is, will this change? Will we start seeing power meter pedals on the men's peloton? And the answer, I think, to that is yes. In fact, I even reached out to Wahoo, who sponsors Team Education First here, and a bunch of other tour teams, and they also make their own power meter pedals. But their power meter pedals are not on Team Education First, but they do have the regular pedals there. And they said one of the core reasons, as I mentioned earlier on, for the lack of power meter pedals today is those existing drivetrain sponsorships that are in the way. But in the case of Team Education First, which does have the Power to Max power meter on there, but I would suspect that Team Education First isn't like hard wed to that power meter. And I would guess equally as much, Power to Max isn't probably hard wed to sponsoring the multiple teams of the Tour de France they do today. So it wouldn't surprise me to see teams like Education First in the future go to a Wahoo power meter pedal, as well as some other teams that don't have those top level Shimano like hardened sponsorships. So teams like Cofidis, for example, and notably Cofidis also has a Wahoo sponsorship in place as well. So why isn't Garmin sponsoring any teams? Well, 2 factors. One, Garmin actually sponsors more teams than anyone else here, plus Tax Trainers, which Garmin owns. So all that's there. But to add power meters to the mix will require Garmin to spend a ton more across those teams. There are some teams that are kind of like open, if you will. So teams like UAE or Team Bahrain. But I would suspect for Garmin, a very conservative company when it comes to kind of sponsorships and things like that, probably isn't going to sponsor either of those teams for political reasons. And they don't today. For example, we see Team Bahrain using Garmin products, but they're not sponsored by Garmin. They're just buying their own products and using them. Now, whether or not we see power meter pedals on the men's side in the future remains to be seen. But the thing to keep in mind is having your name on the side of a bus doesn't mean a lot when it comes to whether or not you should actually buy that product. And that's true of every single product that we see here at the Tour de France. These are just paid sponsorships. That's what makes this whole thing go around, and it has nothing to do with how good your product is. With that, thanks for watching and have a good one. I just ended the video, but check out this line of sponsorships. If I had done this video again, I would do it right here. This is insane. Like, who does not sponsor Team Intermarché Wanty? Everyone sponsors them. I feel like we need to just count all these for the fun of it. Intermarché, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, questionable, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 57 sponsors. Welcome to the tour.